Imagine this. You're the most powerful king in Europe. You command armies, rule over vast lands, and think, hey, why not appoint my buddy Bob as a bishop? He owes me a favor. But just as you're about to hand Bob the bishop's staff, a letter arrives from the Pope. It says something like, "Dear King, you can't do that anymore. Bishops are my thing. Love, the Pope." Now you're thinking, wait a minute, who's running this kingdom? Welcome to the Investiture Controversy, the medieval power struggle where emperors and popes basically played a centuries-long game of who's the boss. Spoiler alert, there's no sitcom ending here. Instead, we get excommunications, dramatic snow-covered apologies, and even a couple of anti-popes. Yep, anti-popes. But this wasn't just about hurt feelings or bruised egos. This was about the fate of Europe, who would control the power to appoint bishops, leaders who weren't just spiritual guides, but also wielded political clout and military muscle. Was the church destined to rise above kings, or would monarchs keep their grip on God's earthly emissaries? The Investiture Controversy didn't just pop into existence overnight. It was the culmination of centuries of political maneuvering, divine proclamations, and a hearty dose of medieval stubbornness. Picture this. Europe in the early Middle Ages was like a giant game of chess, except the bishops were both knights and bishops. Kings had more power than the rules technically allowed, and the Pope was trying to play God with a rather smug confidence. In those days, the church wasn't just about saving souls and organizing feast days. Oh no, it was also a sprawling empire of land, wealth, and influence. Bishops were not merely spiritual shepherds guiding their flocks toward eternal bliss. They were also feudal lords, managing estates, collecting taxes, and even commanding armies. A bishopric was essentially a plum government job with divine perks. Naturally, kings and emperors wanted to make sure these valuable positions were filled by loyal allies, preferably relatives or buddies who wouldn't rock the royal boat. Here's where the concept of lay investiture comes in. Lay investiture was the practice where secular rulers, like kings and emperors, appointed bishops and abbots. Imagine a medieval job interview where the king says, "I like your faith, but how are you with managing tax revenues and staying loyal to me when the Pope gets fussy?" The candidate would bow deeply, promise undying loyalty, and be handed the symbols of their office, a ring and a staff, representing their spiritual and earthly duties. For centuries, this arrangement worked splendidly for the rulers. They got compliant bishops who could double as administrators, and everyone else got to pretend this was all in line with God's will. The church, however, wasn't entirely comfortable with this setup. After all, bishops were supposed to be chosen for their piety and virtue, not because they were second cousins to the duke. By the 10th century, the cracks in this system were beginning to show. The church, reeling from centuries of corruption and interference, started whispering about reform. The whispers turned into bold proclamations in the 11th century, fueled by movements like the Cluniac reforms. These reformers, based in the monastic town of Cluny, were like the medieval equivalent of a revolutionary think tank. They believed the church should be independent, its leaders chosen without the grubby hands of kings meddling in holy affairs. After all, wasn't the kingdom of God supposed to be separate from the kingdoms of men? The reformers were idealistic, but they also knew how to get under a monarch's skin. They pointed out the glaring hypocrisy of kings and emperors meddling in the church's business while expecting the clergy to preach obedience to divine law. "How can we tell peasants to follow the 10 Commandments?" they grumbled, when their bishop got his job because he plays poker with the kings. Adding to this mix of high-stakes politics and theological angst was the sheer drama of the medieval mindset. Everyone, from the Pope down to the lowliest serf, genuinely believed that the fate of their immortal soul was tied to these earthly power struggles. This wasn't just about politics. It was about salvation, about whose version of Christianity would ultimately hold sway. Kings believed they were divinely chosen to rule and had every right to control the clergy within their realms. The popes, however, were starting to push back, claiming that their authority came directly from God and trumped any earthly king's mandate. By the time Pope Gregory VII stepped onto the scene in the late 11th century, the tension was crackling. Gregory, who could have been played by a fiery Anthony Hopkins in a medieval drama, was not the type to back down. He believed that the church needed to be purified, and that meant wresting control of bishop appointments away from secular rulers. On the other side was Emperor Henry IV, a young and ambitious ruler who probably thought Gregory was more trouble than he was worth. To Henry, the Pope was just another cleric who needed to be reminded of his place in the grand scheme of imperial dominance. So, what you had was a setup for one of the greatest power struggles in European history. A battle not just over who got to pick bishops, but over the very question of who was the ultimate authority in Christendom. The Pope with his heavenly keys, or the Emperor with his earthly sword. It was a showdown that would be part soap opera, part theological debate, and entirely medieval in its intensity. And boy, did it set the stage for some epic drama. Gregory VII was not a man to mince words or tolerate half measures. Before he donned the papal tiara, he was Hildebrand, a monk with a fiery passion for reform. When he became Pope in 1073, Gregory launched the Gregorian reforms, a series of measures aimed at cleaning up the Church's act. These reforms targeted everything from simony, the buying and selling of church offices, to clerical celibacy. But the one reform that really ruffled royal feathers was his stance on lay investiture. This practice, where kings and nobles appointed bishops and handed them symbols of spiritual authority, a ring and a staff, was, in Gregory's view, a brazen overreach into the Church's holy domain. Now, you might wonder, why were kings so insistent on appointing bishops? Was it because they had a deep, abiding interest in theology? Not exactly. Bishops weren't just spiritual leaders. They were feudal lords, controlling vast lands and armies. Appointing a bishop wasn't just a religious decision, it was a political move. A king who appointed a loyal bishop essentially secured a powerful ally in his court or on the battlefield. So when Gregory declared, in his bold Dictatus Papae of 1075, that only the Pope had the authority to appoint or depose bishops, it wasn't just a theological statement. It was a direct challenge to royal power. Enter Emperor Henry IV, a young, ambitious ruler of the Holy Roman Empire who is not about to let an upstart pope tell him how to run his empire. Henry IV was everything Gregory detested. Imperious, stubborn, and in Gregory's eyes, entirely too cozy with the idea of meddling in church affairs. Henry was used to calling the shots when it came to appointing bishops in his realm. When Gregory started flexing his papal muscles, Henry responded with all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. He appointed his own Bishop of Milan, blatantly ignoring Gregory's orders. The Pope was furious, and Henry's defiance sparked an exchange of letters that can only be described as medieval mic-dropping. Gregory wrote to Henry, accusing him of arrogance and reminding him that kings ruled at the pleasure of God, and by extension, the Pope, God's earthly representative. Henry's reply was equally scathing. He addressed Gregory not as Pope, but simply as Hildebrand, pointedly refusing to acknowledge his spiritual authority. The letter bristled with contempt, with Henry essentially telling Gregory to stick to prayers and leave politics to the professionals. The conflict escalated quickly. Gregory, unwilling to let this challenge go unanswered, took the nuclear option. He excommunicated Henry IV. Let's pause here to appreciate the gravity of excommunication in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just a spiritual penalty, it was a political disaster. By cutting Henry off from the church, Gregory declared him unfit to rule. Henry's vassals, bound to him by oaths sworn before God, now had a holy mandate to rebel. Suddenly, the young emperor found himself fighting not just the Pope, but his own nobility. If you think Gregory might have paused to gloat, you'd be mistaken. For Gregory, this was not a game. It was a divine mission. In his mind, he was not merely a pope. He was the guardian of Christendom, tasked with saving the church from worldly corruption. For Henry, it was a humiliating blow, but the emperor was nothing if not determined. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic episodes of medieval history, with popes and emperors vying for supremacy in a clash that would reshape Europe. And this was just the beginning. The climax of Investiture Controversy was nothing short of a medieval soap opera, with twists, drama, and enough intrigue to make even the most stoic monk raise an eyebrow. The story came to a head when Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV two larger-than-life figures found themselves locked in a battle that would determine the fate of Europe's spiritual and temporal balance. Gregory, a reform-minded pope with a backbone of steel, had already made it clear that he wasn't about to let any king play puppeteer with the church. His Dictatus Papae of 1075 was a bold declaration of papal supremacy, a document that essentially said, "I'm the boss of you, and that's final." Henry IV, a young and headstrong emperor who probably hadn't learned the finer points of diplomacy in school, wasn't having it. He believed his divine right as emperor gave him the authority to appoint bishops and invest them with power, a practice that was as old as the empire itself. What followed was a clash of wills that quickly escalated from a theological debate into an all-out political brawl. Gregory condemned Henry's actions, particularly his insistence on appointing his own man as Bishop of Milan, a plum position that came with both religious prestige and significant political clout. In response, Henry sent Gregory a letter so disrespectful it could have singed the parchment. To Hildebrand, who pretends to be pope but is really a false monk, it began, setting the tone for what was essentially a medieval burn letter. Gregory wasn't one to back down from a fight. In 1076, he did something unprecedented. He excommunicated Henry. Imagine the scene. Messengers delivering the Pope's decree across Europe, announcing that Henry was no longer recognized as emperor by God, the Church, or the faithful. His subjects were released from their oaths of loyalty, and Henry found himself spiritually and politically isolated. Excommunication wasn't just a religious slap on the wrist. It was a medieval equivalent of being canceled on every platform, with no hope of a comeback. Henry, now scrambling to hold his empire together, realized he had to act fast to repair the damage. What followed was one of the most dramatic moments in medieval history, the infamous walk to Canossa. In the winter of 1077, Henry traveled to the castle of Canossa in northern Italy, where Gregory was staying. And this wasn't a cozy road trip. Henry crossed the snow-covered Alps, braving freezing temperatures and treacherous paths. By the time he arrived at Canossa, he was cold, tired, and desperate, a far cry from the arrogant ruler who had penned that inflammatory letter. Now picture this. Henry, the Holy Roman Emperor, standing barefoot in the snow, wearing a penitent's robe, begging for forgiveness. He waited outside the castle gates for 3 days, a spectacle that must have been equal parts pitiful and surreal. Gregory, ever the shrewd politician, made him wait. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about power. Gregory was making it crystal clear to the watching world who held the upper hand in this conflict. When Gregory finally relented and lifted the excommunication, it wasn't the end of the story. Henry had been forgiven, yes, but the conflict was far from resolved. He returned to Germany to deal with rebellious nobles who had used his excommunication as an excuse to challenge his authority. And while he was busy fighting to keep his throne, Gregory continued to assert the church's independence, even as his own position became increasingly precarious. Henry, not one to forgive and forget, regrouped and struck back with a vengeance. In 1080, he declared Gregory deposed and appointed an anti-pope, Clement III, in his place. If you think political coups are dramatic now, imagine one where the losing side claims divine backing. Henry's forces marched on Rome, and by 1084, he had Gregory driven into exile. The Pope, who had made an emperor grovel in the snow, died far from his seat of power, a poignant end to a man who had dared to defy the might of the empire. But here's the twist. While Henry might have won the immediate battle, the Church ultimately claimed victory in the long run. The drama of Investiture Controversy set the stage for the Concordat of Worms decades later, which would tilt the balance of power in favor of papacy. Gregory's principles lived on, even as Henry's empire began to fracture under the weight of internal dissent and external pressures. So, while the walk to Canossa is often remembered as a symbol of papal dominance, it's also a reminder that history, like life, is full of irony. Henry's penitence may have been theatrical, but it was also strategic. Gregory's triumph was real, but so was his exile. And through it all, the medieval world watched, perhaps with a mix of awe, disbelief, and a little bit of schadenfreude. As we reflect on this remarkable chapter in history, we're left with one undeniable fact. medieval power struggles were anything but boring. They were a blend of high-stakes drama, ruthless ambition, and just a touch of absurdity, the perfect ingredients for a story that still captures our imagination today.